I thank the member for Fraser. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I give the call to the member for Hotham.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity to speak about the 100th anniversary of landings in Gallipoli. It's in fact one of the real privileges in my 2 years in this House to be able to make such a contribution. And I say that because I very genuinely believe that Anzac and the story of Anzac matters, and that Gallipoli very much matters. And I'll speak about some of the reasons that I really believe that. But I also believe, Deputy Speaker, that it's very important that when we talk about war, we don't gloss over the horrors and the realities of the experience of being in a war. As members of Parliament in particular, I think it's important for us to really reflect on the realities of this experience, because it's us in this chamber that hold the power to send our young men off to war, young men and women off to war. And I've been reflecting in thinking about some remarks today on what it must have been like for the young men, and there are some accounts that I wanted to share with the House that are diary entries from soldiers who were there at landing at Gallipoli. The first entry is of an anonymous soldier. He said, "I arrived with the rest of the fleet. It was pitch black. Everyone is in a state of eager excitement. Transport boats are lowered, all men are lined up on deck and the orders issued. At 3:10 a.m, countless numbers of small craft push offshore. The whole side of the mountain seems to be sending forth tongues of flame, and bullets rain upon us. 7 in our boat are killed, and God knows how many in the others. 50 yards from sand, and to wade ashore with the feeling that you are one of the first to put their foot on Turkish soil. Silent forms lay scattered on the beach everywhere." Deputy Speaker, one of the great tragedies reading through the accounts of these young men, and they are mostly men, is the sense of expectation of how different it was that they were led to believe this landing at Gallipoli would be from what actually happened. Another young soldier, Athol Boret, says, "Imagine our surprise when instead of finding open trenches we saw only holes in the ground at intervals of 10 yards or so. A few men managed to get down to the holes in the trench, but many of us just rushed over the front line and got into the rear trenches right amongst the Turks. Then started the most gruesome, bloody and fierce hand-to-hand fighting of the whole war." I think for foreigners coming to Australia, hearing us talk about Anzac, it's obviously it's often a source of real confusion to them, Deputy Speaker, with all of the absolute horrors that were occurring on the shore there in Turkey, but we could celebrate this as a national event and this sort of foundation moment for our country. But I think when you read on further and you look more into other accounts, the way that the young people at Gallipoli responded to what must have been the most shocking adversity that any of us in this House could imagine is something so extraordinary to behold. And I'll read now from a letter from Private Roy Denning. He says, "In the early hours of the morning of 26 April 1915, I heard the officers going along amongst the men, saying, 'Stick to it, lads, don't go to sleep.' And the cheerful reply would be, 'No, sir, we won't go to sleep,' and my heart swelled with admiration. I knew what the ordeal of the strenuous day before had been, and knew what pluck and determination was necessary to keep awake and alert throughout the long, weary hours of the night. Therefore, I thought I was justified in being proud of being Australian. Give me Australians as comrades, and I'll go anywhere duty calls." Deputy Speaker, many of us in this House have had the privilege of studying Australia's history at some of the great universities around our country, and I'm one of them. And as a history student, we're taught constantly that romanticism is to be avoided at all costs. And I completely agree, because if we don't really understand how events occurred, then we can't learn anything from them. But when you look into the history of Gallipoli, one of the most exciting, most happiest kind of feelings that you get from it is that all of the romanticism that we associate with this event in our history actually has a foundation in truth, and these accounts really speak to that. The sense of egalitarianism that we so celebrate amongst one another as Australians, it really was there at Gallipoli. Whatever account you read, whether it's Australians reporting on how Australians treated one another, or soldiers from other countries talking about how the Australians related to one another in the trenches, this constant theme of mateship and the friendship and the fact that there was never this kind of vast chasm between officer and soldier that we saw in so many foreign armies. You hear and you read real accounts about the incredible bravery shown by these soldiers in the face of extraordinary bad luck and adversity. And in a way, I think when we look back on Gallipoli, the idea that this was the moment where these qualities were infused with what it was to be Australian really is true. This is really actually what happened there. Now, one of the other things that I really felt reading a lot of these letters and accounts is that while we can reflect with good feelings about the Australian spirit when we think about how soldiers treated one another, there's no doubt that so many of these soldiers didn't come away with a great love of war, and that wasn't really the feeling that you got from these letters. There was a real sense of sadness about the loss that they saw around them. And I think we saw that, Deputy Speaker, with the conscription debates that were had in 1916 and 1917. Something historians often comment on is that they believe that one of the big differences between the 1916 vote, which was very narrowly lost, and the 1917 vote, which was much more strongly lost, was because so many soldiers had returned to Australia and shared their experiences about what it was like to be in war, and that they didn't want to see other young Australians have to go overseas and fight like they had. There were many marks left on these young men that stuck with them for life, and we owe them something very significant for that. And what we owe them, of course, Deputy Speaker, is to never forget their service. Deputy Speaker, I was lucky, like all in this House, to spend a great deal of time commemorating the event of the 100th anniversary of landing in Gallipoli with my local community. And one of the things that we did was go to our local RSLs and talk to veterans about their memories and recollections of war. They tended not to be World War I veterans, Deputy Speaker, but still great servicemen. We talked to Francis Meyer, who's 98 years young, full of life, and he's a founding member at the Clayton RSL. He talked a lot to us about how Anzac Day, on which he recalls his own service record, is a real time of reflection for him and a moment where he can pay tribute to his fallen mates. I want to mention, Deputy Speaker, Tom Dusting, who was 92 years old and very sadly lost to this world just a few weeks ago. We talked to Tom, and you'd hardly come across an Australian with such a keen sense of humour and such a fighting spirit. And again, on Anzac Day, Tom told us that he often thinks about his fallen mates. So it was a really important opportunity to pay respect to the people in my community who'd served their country in military service. I wanted to mention, Deputy Speaker, the really strong feelings of bipartisanship in my local area in how we commemorated this event. I have lots of people from different sides of politics who represent my local area, and at all these events, Deputy Speaker, we shared the wreaths that we laid in front of the memorials, and I hope I speak for everyone when I say that when we're commemorating service and thinking about war and our nation's history, that these are things that all of us on all sides of the House can celebrate together. I do say, again, Deputy Speaker, that as members of Parliament, it's important for us to understand this history, to think about it, and to really realise the enormity of what we're doing when we send young Australians off to war. Gallipoli is important for lots of reasons, but one of them, Deputy Speaker, is that 8,000 young Australians lost their lives fighting on a foreign shore, and we should never forget that. I'll finish, Deputy Speaker, by again quoting from a letter that a young soldier wrote after the war, and he says, "Thinking over the times I've been through and of the pals I've fought with and whom I've lost, I feel proud that I was one of them in a big venture they laid down their lives in. I need hardly say that this life, being as it is, devoid of all that a man holds dear in life, and that makes life worth living, has not altered me. I've witnessed joy at its highest, sorrow at its deepest. My views on life, comradeship, have broadened. I think I'm telling the truth when I say that I also know the principles on which a man's life can be based. It's easy enough under active, normal conditions to live rightly, but in service, a man being months at a time among horrors unspeakable and away from the soothing influence of home life, it's very hard, and one must learn from experience, and I'm sure it's the best way of forming the base to the life one wishes to live. This is the Anzac spirit, one I'm so proud that has become synonymous with all that is Australian, lest we forget."